Hey guys, my name is Ryan. I'm a tutor in the Econ Tutoring Center. Today I'm going to talk about the elasticity of supply and give you some intuition for what the elasticity of supply tells us. I remember that language and notation may vary by professors, so always check to make sure that the language we're using is the same as your professors. Okay, so the elasticity of supply, just like the other types of elasticity we've talked about, is just a measure of responsiveness, in this case of suppliers, to a change in price. So here's an example, I think graphically, which represents the idea of elasticity here, is that a more horizontal supply curve represents a very high elasticity. So demand, or supply rather, is very elastic, right? So if price changes a little bit, suppliers are able to drastically change their quantity supplied, as opposed to an inelastic supply, whereas when price changes by a bit, suppliers aren't able to change their quantity supplied as much, right? So if I look at a fixed change in, let's call this change in P, and I'm just going to bring this all the way over to this curve here to kind of illustrate the idea, right? So I kind of fix this change in P, right? Whereas here I end up with this change in quantity supplied, whereas here I end up with a much smaller change in quantity supplied, right? So if we were to look at that formula, percentage change in quantity supply divided by percentage change in price, right? The dP is the same for either of those, right? But notice this is going to have a much larger change in quantity supplied, and this will be a much smaller change in quantity supplied. So what that's telling us is that, say there's a demand shock in the economy or something, right? And that changes the price. Suppliers with very inelastic supply aren't going to be able to adjust how much they produce as much as suppliers with a much more elastic supply, right? And so they end up with a much lower elasticity of supply than suppliers like this. Obviously, the other thing to note is that because price and quantity supply have a positive relationship as opposed to demand, we should have this number, because supply is upward sloping, this number should always be positive, whereas the elasticity of demand would always be negative. So that's one thing to note. And then just the larger the number, then the more elastic supply is. And so that's how we can use this elasticity of supply. We can always look at different formulas maybe for how we actually calculate it, but the general idea is the same, that the more elastic means firms are more able to respond to changes in prices. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a better idea of how elasticity of supply works, why it's useful, and how we can use the number that we calculate to kind of interpret what supply looks like for firms. If you have any more questions, come to the Econ Tutoring Center.